Hello, everyone, and good evening. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Spencer Ruckty. I'm the author events manager at Third Place Books here in Seattle, Washington. On behalf of Third Place Books, Seminary Co-op in Chicago, and the publisher Fern Books, I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's conversation with Eduardo Berti, Daniel Levin Becker, and Casey Jarman, who are here with us to discuss An Ideal Presence, Eduardo Berti's new novel translated into English by Daniel Levin Becker. Let's see, through virtual events like today's, Third Place Books and Seminary Co-op are fortunate to continue connecting readers with authors in an intimate setting. We sorely miss having authors in our stores, of course, but at the same time, we are so thankful to have this virtual platform that brings our growing event series into your homes all across the world. So thank you for tuning in and for supporting independent bookstores. Tonight, we are also delighted to be partnering with Seminary Co-op Bookstores. Founded in 1961, in 2019, they became the first not-for-profit bookstore whose mission is bookselling. That mission recognizes bookstores as fundamental civic institutions, and it allows us to work with like-minded partners on events like this one. You should visit them online at semcoop.com, or go check out their stellar event lineup and sign up for their mailing list. Third Place Books is proud to host a number of exciting events this fall, which you can find on our website. Actually, tomorrow we are partnering with the Transnational Literature Series at the Brookline Booksmith in Boston to present Mexican author Yuri Herrera in conversation with translator Lisa Dillman and Bettina Gonzalez. This Wednesday, the 22nd, we're hosting Ruth Azeki in conversation with Karen Joy Fowler, and we have an exciting yet to be announced event in November. We're working again with the Transnational Literature Series to present Isabel Fargo Cole, Harry Kunzru, and Dustin Illingworth discussing the works of German writer Wolfgang Hilbig. For a reminder about these events and more, I encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter at thirdplacebooks.com. During today's event, I'd also like to remind you that the chat window at the bottom of your screen is open, and we encourage you to use it respectfully. Tonight, we will also have some time for your questions. So if you have questions for our authors or publisher this evening, please submit those in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, which is separate from the chat window. We also offer closed captioning to those who are interested. Just hit the live transcript button at the bottom of your window to turn this feature on and off. And finally, as you may have experienced at virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise, and if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. So thank you for your patience and your understanding. Overall, thank you for sticking around during this virtual era. It's strictly because of you that this author series is even possible. And now I'm going to pass the mic over to Kristina Kearns and Daniel Levin Becker. Kristina is the publisher of Fern Books, the reason we are gathered here today. And Daniel Levin Becker is not only the translator of today's featured book, but also an editor at Fern. Daniel is also the author of many subtle channels in praise of potential literature and the forthcoming book, What's Good? Notes on Rap and Language, as well as the translator of, amongst others, Georges Perec's La Boutique Obscure. And Daniel has been a member of the OuLiPo since 2009. So Kristina and Daniel, hello and welcome.
Hi, Spencer. Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here with everyone today, despite the virtual environment, to celebrate Fern's inaugural title, An Ideal Presence. It's really exciting to be able to share this really gorgeous, luminescent book with an American audience. And we're so grateful for all the independent booksellers and librarians and everyone in the United States who's still doing their best to bring together readers and authors. And so thank you to Spencer in particular for putting this event together, but of course everyone at Third Place Books and Seminary Co-op. And I'm gonna hand it over to Daniel now.
I will reiterate Kristina's thanks and give a special shout out to Seminary Co-op, which is my boyhood hometown bookstore. Seminary Co-op and 57th Street Books in Hyde Park. Spent many idyllic hour on the story rug. So yeah, just a quick presentation of Fern Books, which Kristina and I started officially last year, although notionally a few years ago, mostly when we were working together at McSweeney's and were asked to do some editorial projects for non-literary organizations and brands. For instance, we made a wellness magazine for a mattress company. We made a children's book for a shoe company. And we really enjoyed the work of sort of juxtaposing literary endeavor with unexpected places you wouldn't normally expect to find literary work. So that's sort of driven the vision for Fern. But of course, the staple is books, which we love deeply. And so during the confinement, in a fit of restlessness and pique, we decided to go ahead and publish An Ideal Presence, which was a book that had come my way through Eduardo. As we'll discuss this evening, it was the first book that he wrote in French, and I'm a translator from French. And so he approached me and asked if I'd be interested in translating it, which of course I was. And by last year, I had already translated it and figured what better way to start a press than by keeping it in the family, so to speak, by translating a book, a really wonderful book, as you'll discover this evening. Sorry, it's evening here in Paris, this afternoon, probably where you guys are. But yeah, to do a book by a dear friend, and in a moment where it felt like the world needed it. So we'll talk more about that. Our next book, which we're going to be putting out in June, will be a book, another translation from French by Christine Gutmann. The book is called Papers, by the French stage performer and novelist Violaine Schwartz, which is a very poetic assemblage of, among other things, testimonies from interviews with asylum seekers and people who've made it to France from all over the world, fleeing horrifying things and arriving in France and greeting new, calmer, horrifying things, namely bureaucracy. And well, I won't spoil it any further than that. It's a beautiful book, and we're really excited to be announcing it soon. And that's Fern. Kristina, do you have anything you, am I forgetting anything?
No, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Well, then it's my great pleasure to introduce, to bring on stage, as it were, Casey and Eduardo, two dear friends who I've known and worked with for about the same amount of time. Casey I met when he became the managing editor of The Believer, which is a magazine based in San Francisco, was based in San Francisco at the time, published by McSweeney's. It has since migrated to Las Vegas. But Casey came into that world, this magazine where I was an editor, and very quickly, with great humor and aplomb, took over this very strange, unwieldy magazine ship and steered it masterfully for several years. I don't have your official bio in front of me, but he's a great guy. And part of the reason that we invited him here this evening is that he is the author of a book called Death, An Oral History. Thank you. My copy is in a closet in the United States somewhere, which is a collection of incredibly eloquent and thought-provoking discussions with a really wide range of people who have different experiences of death, different philosophical approaches, different really pragmatic or political or ethical approaches. And it's just a really, it's superbly done, and it's will do so much to open your mind into thinking about death, which is this thing that is so taboo and so something we're so afraid to confront head on in so many ways. And this book is really, it's really a gift in terms of ways to think about this thing that is present in all of our lives and is their necessary conclusion. I don't know why I was smiling when I said that. Eduardo Berti, I met when he became a member of the OuLiPo in 2014, I believe. He's an Argentinian by birth, but has lived in Europe for about 20 years, if I'm correct. We didn't actually meet for a year or so, but very quickly I saw why the OuLiPo chose to elect him as a member. He's the author of a sprawling and consistently brilliant body of work that includes novels and music writing and translations and just a whole lot of kind of unclassifiable things that are all consistently very thoughtful, very strange, very melancholy in the way that, at least for me, literature really should be. If it's not going to be utilitarian, not going to be overly sensationalistic, Eduardo has this incredible knack for positing a little bit of a thought experiment and leaving it in the corner to glow in its own light and let you discover it on your own terms, on your own time. So thank you both for joining us. I'm really delighted to have you here to present An Ideal Presence. I'll give a quick reading to start things off, but Eduardo, maybe you can tell us just very briefly what the genesis of the project was.
Yeah, of course. I was invited 6 years ago, in 2015, I was invited to Rouen, to a city in the north of France, the city of Madame Bovary, to spend some weeks initially in a hospital, sharing and being and seeing and being like a spy in a unit of palliative care in the hospital of Rouen. They wanted to invite a writer there. They had never done that before, but they wanted to invite a writer, and all that they expected was perhaps a small text, 5-10 pages, not more than that. And my question was, I will be able to write 4, 5, or 10 pages about this. I didn't know what was going to happen, really. And 2 weeks later, I had three notebooks filled with notes and impressions and things I have noted. And I soon realized that a small text was not a good idea, that what I was finding there, what I was discovering was too big for a small text. And so that changed the whole thing. We had a meeting, and I said, well, I really want to write a book. It was not the contract. It was not what they expected. It was not what I expected. But I needed to write a book, more than I wanted. I needed to write a book about all that. And so we decided to remake the whole residency. Initially it was it was planned that I should spend 3 or 4 weeks, not more than that. And finally, I spent several months, and I wrote a book. I wrote this book. That was a double surprise. First surprise, I wrote this book that I never thought I was going to write. And second, I wrote this book in French, another thing that I never thought I was going to do in my life. And well, we can speak about all this lately, but this is the story, just to start. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so the result is 55 different, I think it's 55 different testimonials. Most of them are very short. There are a few that are what you would call short story length, but most of them are not more than a few paragraphs long. And they're just the voices of different people who work in this palliative care unit, talking about their experiences working there, not necessarily talking about death, not necessarily talking about specific interactions they've had with patients or patients' families. It's really a sort of kaleidoscopic view of death and care at the end of life through the eyes of people who deal with it every day, whose profession is really to look death in the face. So I'm going to read two quick excerpts. The first is from Marie-France Bergeret, who is the mobile unit doctor. This morning, Josephine and I went a few kilometers away to visit an old woman, 99 years old. It's funny to say, but she doesn't look 99. She seems much younger. Let's say 82 or 83. I don't know. After 80, I have a hard time estimating ages. In spite of her healthy appearance, this woman no longer wants to eat, no longer wants to take medicine or sedatives. She's tired of everything, of her body, of her pain, of seeing her family waste time at her bedside. I'm even tired of the sunrise, she told us. But her children and grandchildren don't agree. They want to have someone in their family reach 100. It would be a pity, as they see it, to fall short by so little. There's a bit of egotism in all this, to be sure, but at base, there's something inspiring in it, a little bit of affectionate bait to spur on the almost 100-year-old. The lady will turn 100 in 4 months, in October. 4 months, a trifle for you, for me, for her children and her grandchildren. For her, though, it's like crossing the desert. She told me this in confidence, furrowing her eyebrows. I can't do it. And she added, the idea of being 100 horrifies me. And then she let out a bitter laugh while we gave her a sedative injection and Josephine spoke with her family. Just then I remembered that I had bought train tickets this morning for a trip my husband and I are taking in December. And such a simple thing struck me as obscene. And the second text is from Mireille Gosselin, who's the unit manager. When I hear that palliative care is the unit where people go before they die, instead of getting huffy, instead of explaining more or less patiently that we also treat pain in cases that don't involve imminent death, instead of that, I answer in the affirmative. I smile, my sweetest smile. I say, yes, that's right, good point. And then I add that you could in fact make the same claim about all the departments in the hospital, any hospital, because all told, everything worth calling life is just the set of things we do before we die, isn't it? And that, I can assure you, never fails to make an impression. So that's quick sampling of the kinds of perspectives, some very head-on, some more indirect, often very unexpected, about death and about the end of life that you find in this book. And the first question I want to ask both of you is what sorts of anxieties and feelings and preoccupations and maybe biases did you bring to your project? Did you have an attitude about death that you wanted to learn more about as it affected you or in the abstract? Or was it something that you hadn't given that much thought?
Casey.
Sorry, we'll start with Casey.
I'll start because mine might be easier. I was just terrified of death and thinking about it in a sort of existential crises way often, but I had very little practical experience with it. And so for me, that was the project of working on my book. Was I had this theory that if I could deep dive into it with other people, it would prepare me for losing friends and family members in my own life. I thought the more that I could sit with it and try to be comfortable with it, that it would kind of, I guess, kind of work like a vaccine now that I think about it. I thought maybe, you know, exposing my body to a certain amount of grief would make grief easier down the line when I actually confronted it in my own life. And I don't think that's true. And I think what I learned from the book that I didn't expect was that you have to go through it, and if you don't go through it, the grieving process, if you try to skip over it, you're really robbing yourself of such an essential part of the human experience, a part that really sucks and is really difficult and can be horrific. But I think there's no skipping steps when it came to death. So that was my arc of what I hoped to get out of it and what I actually got out of it.
In my case, it wasn't death, the subject or the obsession or the, how to say, the obsession at the beginning. It wasn't death. I know, and I'm sure that death and pain are two big elements in the book, and also in daily life in a palliative care unit. But I always say that to me, An Idea Present is not a book about death. It's a book about life, but not in a new age message of life. I mean, in a real sense of the word. What the question, I think, is how do you live a daily life, professional and personal life, in a place like that, where death is so big and so heavy and so omnipresent? And that's why the perspective of the caregivers was the perspective that I wanted to use for my book, because I thought that was the point of the interesting and the singular point of view that I could work in this book. I had the very big privilege that I was accepted by all the caregivers. They opened the doors. Exceptionally, they opened the doors for me, for a writer that was going there to visit them, and they not only opened the doors. I can say that they opened their hearts, because they told me and they showed me several things. They even invited me to come tonight. You'll see that during night things are different. Come this weekend, you'll see that things are different. So they opened several doors to me, and I really thought this was an enormous privilege, that I was having a perspective and a point of view that to have an interesting point of view for a writer is always a great gift, I think. And I had a good point of view, and the subject was also interesting, both things. So it was impossible not to write a book about that, and about this tension, if we can say it like this, between these people that are alive with any health problem and all these patients and all these daily situations that are so near to death and to pain. That was for me from the beginning the thing, really.
One of the things that I got from Casey's book was also just the importance of not only the importance of confronting death for your own mental health and for making peace with grief, but the richness of it. That there's this thing that we spend so much energy not talking about, sort of diverting the conversation anytime it becomes too unpleasant, too close to expectations about death or the logistics of death. And that not only are we doing ourselves a disservice because it makes it more awkward and more difficult to deal with when our time comes to deal with it for a loved one or for ourselves, but also that there's just this whole kind of plane of spirituality and meaning and in a way helping us define what life means when we allow ourselves to tap into it.
And I don't know if Eduardo had this same experience, but to me, talking to people about, losing loved ones or being close to someone who is in this situation, it brings the storyteller out of people too. I've found that having all these conversations with people about death, people who I wouldn't particularly think of as great storytellers, like when you're talking about something that's so close to you as losing a parent or a loved one, or, you know, going through the process of trying to figure out what's next. It just brings this like deep sense of, this deep, rich sense of storytelling and of identity out of people that is like completely fascinating to me. And of course, after writing this book, you know, so many people would come up to me and say, "Oh yeah, you know, my dad died last year. Let me tell you about it." And all of a sudden, you're receiving all these stories, and to me, that was a really humanizing thing, because when people are talking about death, they're talking about love. Invariably, they're talking about love because they're talking about losing something that meant so much to them, or learning to cope with that. So I wonder how that played out for you too, Eduardo, to add on to Daniel's question.
Yeah, it's true what you say, Casey. And what happened in this unit in particular, there were some caregivers that I think they were more conscious about this. Perhaps the nurses that had more experience, they were quite conscious about all this. And when I arrived, they told me, "Eduardo, you'll see this unit is like a novel, that we have so many stories to tell you." But not everybody was so conscious about this. And in the middle, let's say more than in the middle, almost at the end of my residency, I made a reading. I read to the caregivers some of the first stories I have written. And it was very emotional, very surprising for all of us, for them especially. And some of these nurses or nursing aides approached me after the reading, and with the surprise that we have all these stories to tell. You discovered all these stories. I didn't discover these stories. The stories were there, and they were waiting for someone to write them, if we can say it like that. But all these stories were there. Some people in the unit were more conscious about this. Some were surprised. But of course, all these stories were there, and it's always about love, and it's always about empathy, and it's always about helping somebody, and it's also always about what decisions you do in the last moments of your life. What is, you know that you have a little time, and what things you didn't do that you need to do now, and what things you want to change. Perhaps you won't be able to do it. And most of the stories are around these things, finally. Love, empathy, and especially from the point of view of caregivers, this wonderful capacity they have to listen and to put themselves in the place of the other, and try to understand what is the best for the patient or for the family of the patient, which is it seems easy, but it's so difficult. It's so difficult. Yeah.
That makes me think of something that an artistic decision that you both make in your books, which is basically to leave yourselves out. In Casey's case, the oral histories are basically structured as interviews, except we don't see the questions that you've asked. It reads like a long, fluid monologue on different topics. And Eduardo, there are cases, including one reading that I'll ask you to do in a minute, if we can persuade you to read. There, every now and then, you have a character who is speaking to you, the author, is the sort of intruder in the midst of this unit. But for the most part, not to play on words, but your presence is one that's very absent, and in a really special way. I think that opens up it opens up the storytelling ability that Casey was invoking just now, and still makes it possible for the people to, for these characters whose stories we're reading, to feel organized, feel like it's more intimate because there's somebody in the room with them, even though we don't see that person. So I'm interested in how both of you came to that decision and whether that was something that you struggled with in any ways during the writing process.
Why don't you go first, Eduardo? I'm more curious about you.
Okay, this time I go first. In the beginning, I thought I was going to be really invisible. That was the first idea I had. But I wrote the first. I didn't write the book in order. The texts were not written in the order that you can read them now. But one day I wrote the first text, Pauline Jourdan, and I knew that this text, I wanted it to be the first one because I think it's also like déclaration de principe. How do you say that in Daniel? In English, like yeah, okay. And I thought that this story could be read like that, and in this story, the shadow of the writer or the presence of the writer is there. I never speak. The writer never speaks, but the writer is there, like when you see the shadow of the camera, or the shadow of the hand of the puppet, puppeteer, you say, the one that moves the puppets. And so I decided to do this 2 or 3 times in the book, especially also in another case that is the moment that there is a story that it's told by a lady that goes to read to the patients, that reads books. And it's true that this lady existed, and I'm a writer, and we talked a lot about books. And even one day she told me, "Do you want to come with me?" So I said, well, I can't be really invisible in this story either. And then there is a third story that is a little bit more fictional, where there is one nurse, I don't remember now, but I think it's a nurse, that tells me about his brother that wanted to be a writer. And she tells me a story. So there are 3 or 4 small moments like this. Perhaps because because really my presence was not really invisible. They knew I was there. They knew I was there. There were moments where they forgot. They arrived to forget my presence, or that I arrived to make them forget my presence. But there were moments that they were really conscious that I was there. So I finally said to myself, okay, I'll write 3 or 4 moments where I'm there as a writer. Also to remind that this book there is a lot of real thing in this book, a lot of, I won't use the word journalism, but there's a lot of investigation, but there's also fiction in this book. So perhaps this decision to make the writer present perhaps is another way to remind that there are some elements of fiction in this book also.
I've been thinking about that a lot since reading it, and partly I think because I've thought about my own process and how, depending on what you include in the story and what you leave out of the story, there's already this element of authorship that happens. And I think for my part, I think in this book, in my book, I think I'm there through the sort of shot selection of the people I talk to, and I'm there in some of the the things obviously I'm there in the questions, even though the questions aren't in the book. And so to me, I've never, since editing it, I haven't sat down and read my book all the way through, but when I go through and look at pieces, it still feels like me, because I'm transported back to those conversations and those people and those places. And I got to interview some of my favorite people and family members. And, I think for me, it's the organizing principle that I used, because I didn't have any clear, unlike Eduardo, I had a scope and a setting. I'm all over the place with mine. But that's one of the things I really love about Eduardo's book, is by the end, you feel like you have spent time in this place, and like I have my idea of what the rooms look like and what the people look like, and it just has a sense of place that I really appreciate as a reader.
Oh, that's good news for me. If you have that impression, it's wonderful, because although I invented some little things in the book, what I really wanted to transmit to any reader was this atmosphere I knew, and this passion for the work that all the caregivers have. And in this level, I wanted to be very, very faithful. And so I'm very glad that you felt that you were there. That's good news.
I would also say that I have 4 nurses in my family, my brother and sister-in-law, or my stepsister. And so I have four nurses, and they tell me stories from the hospital. But I think I learned a lot more from reading your book. So now I can go back to them with some technical knowledge too, and some more things to talk to them about.
I'd love to get into what you started to say, Eduardo, about how it's both fiction and not fiction, but maybe first you can read us Pauline's chapter.
Yeah, I'll try to do my best in English. It's a pity, your translation is so good. I'm going to ruin it a little bit.
You're not going to ruin it.
Yeah. Pauline Jourdan is a nursing aide.
So this is the first piece of the book.
Yeah, each text is I don't know if I'm in the camera right now or not, but each text is presented like this. There's the name of the narrator and the role of the work she does. Most of them are women in this unit. So she says, Pauline, no, I won't be reading your book. You've come here, I'm told, to put our work, our reality into words. I haven't read anything of yours, I'm sorry. Perhaps I'm prejudiced, but each time I see doctors or nurses or nursing aides in a novel, in a film or on television, honestly, I want to laugh. Either it's excessive, a catalog of cheap dramas, or it's embellished, rose-colored, but it's never true, no, never. Because when they exaggerate, when they use our work to present a spectacle of human suffering, even in those cases, the images are so over the top, you'd think they were special effects. So you'll excuse me, but I'm not going to read your book. I'm afraid I won't see anything I recognize in it, that I'll discover a washed out version of my testimony, or even worse, that I'll feel betrayed. That said, if I've agreed to speak to you, it's not only to tell you I won't be reading your book. I agreed above all because I never refuse to speak about what I do. It must be quite different for you when a writer, an architect, a chef, a lawyer, an actor is invited to a dinner party and starts talking about his or her work. Maybe people say, oh, how interesting, or maybe they think, oh, how boring. But nobody even dares to say, stop talking about your work, you are ruining dinner. Nurses and nursing aides know that's what everyone is thinking in their case. It happens to us so often that many of us have developed the prudent habit of just staying silent. at least outside our circle. How many of my colleagues have you spoken to? Have they told you about the funeral makeup, the vomit, the cleaning tasks of hospital workers? Are you going to describe all of that? Are you going to ruin the reader's dinner? Really? I'm asking because I won't read you, no matter how you answer.
Thank you so much. So there's so much in that one moment of conversation. You see the devotion to the work that you were describing, Eduardo. You see the reservation, the sort of hesitancy to open yourself to something that's often treated in a clumsy way or an avoidant way. And there's just this beautiful kind of tension, as you were describing, between the passion of the work and kind of protectiveness about it.
Yeah. Another thing is this difficulty they usually have, or at least they told me in this unit, they had this difficulty to talk about their work. This feeling that it might be uncomfortable to talk about their work, and this is something that they told me a lot of times. Oh, it's good to talk with you about this because, you know, I decided not to talk about this when I'm home during the weekend, or when I'm invited to a party, or when I'm invited to a dinner. I don't want to ruin the dinner or the party. So even if there is a bit of fiction in this text, even if there was no nurse that told me exactly this, and there is no text in the book that reproduces textually what somebody told me, because even some texts are in some cases I've mixed the 2 or 3 things. In this text, there are a lot of things that they told me, even if this character doesn't exist, even if all these things were not said like that in that order. This text is full of things that they told me, like this situation in the dinner, and etc. and etc. And that was perhaps the challenge to find like a narrative axe or a narrated situation where I can be faithful to all the things that they told me about. But it's different. Some texts are really very near to some stories they told me, and some others I needed like a story, or I needed like an angle or an approach so that I could put all the things I wanted to insert there. So there is not a recipe. It's not a formula. In some texts are almost, for example, the text about the male nurse. Daniel, you remember the text, I imagine. It's almost 100% faithful to what this guy told me. It's one of the examples where I invented nothing there. And other texts, I had to work a bit more. But I also wanted to explore this. Can I invent a little bit here? Not changing anything in the level of the professional work. In that level, I was always faithful.
We talked about, if you don't mind me jumping in a little bit, Daniel, we talked in our preparing for this a little bit about that idea. And I really thought that a lot of the pieces in the book were about kind of in the way that journalism has this idea of objectivity, and you know, nobody knows exactly what it is, but the idea is that you're supposed to be pretty objective. And I felt like so many of these characters, these people, were struggling with with that, where they had a certain idea of how connected or disconnected to a patient they should be, for example, and they were fighting with themselves to try to maintain a distance. And I wondered if that was a conscious theme from you. And I also wondered on a sort of meta level, if you had to do some maintaining of distance from these people, from these stories, and if maybe that was part of the role that fiction played for you.
Yeah, I think that is one of the big questions and one of the big subjects. The title of the book is also the result of all this. One of the oldest in the unit invited me to spend the night in the unit and to see really what happens when in the middle of the night. That is very different. The unit is very different. And so I accepted. I went there. And we had a coffee and we talked. We had more time to talk at night because time is different. And so she asked me, well, how are things going on for you here? And I said to her, well, I'm still trying to find my distance, my ideal distance. I said something like this, and in all the senses, in an emotional sense, of course, but also in a physical sense. Where do I settle to observe? How do I interact with your work? I don't want to bother, but so I was trying to find my place and my distance. And so she laughed and she said what I wrote in the book. I told her, I'm going to use this. I didn't realize in that moment that this was the title of the book, but I very quickly realized that this was a great lesson. Even we forget about the book. It was a lesson for my life, what she was telling me. And she told me, well, you know, what you say about distance is wonderful. I spent several years trying to find my ideal distance until I discovered that what I needed to find here was my ideal presence. And I think that I didn't write an ideal presence to give lessons. I took lessons, in fact, from these people. But I think that if there is a lesson in this book, it's that moment. And I wanted to share it with everybody. And I think that that's the big question. Most of the stories deal, as you say, Casey, it's really true what you say. Most of the stories deal finally with this emotional problem. Most of the caregivers told me that sometimes they had to stop or ask for a 3 months or for 2 weeks because the empathy and the compromise and the engagement is so big that sometimes they need to, even if they have theoretically they have professional weapons to keep distance, and they have them and they use them, but even though they need to speak with the psychologists in the unit, and they need sometimes, okay, I need to stop, and because it's a very special work, really very special work, especially in a unit like that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think it's time to turn it over to audience questions.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm back. First of all, thank you, Casey, Daniel, and Eduardo. This conversation has been so wonderful, and we're so happy to have you all here. So while we're waiting for audience questions to come in, please, if you're watching now, submit to the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, and I will be kind of facilitating this portion of the event. But while we're waiting, I do have a question of my own. Eduardo, could you talk more about the decisions you made to fictionalize some of the observations and conversations that you write about in this book? Was there an instinct you followed that told you to invent as opposed to stay, faithful to like a transcript you were recording of the characters in your book? And Casey, this question I think applies to your book as well, if I'm not mistaken. I'd love to hear from both of you.
Well, yeah, at the beginning it was an intuition. We can use that word. From the beginning, my approach was the approach of a writer, not of a journalist or not of a documentarist.
Mm-hmm.
But in the middle of my work, I also used fiction as a kind of weapon, if we can use that word. Mm-hmm. Because 3 or 4 times I had an idea, I had a possible fiction idea that I thought that it connected very well with a lot of things that they had told me. And I thought that it was a small, sometimes there were little situations, very small situations, but I think that they helped to connect several things. And so what I started doing was to tell them this idea and to ask them, what will you do, or what will it happen? What do you think that will happen if, it's the big question of fiction. What will it happen if? That's the big question in general of fiction. The 2 questions in fiction are imagine that, or what will it happen if? And basically I turned this question to them. And it was very interesting because sometimes the answer was, well, this really almost happened once. And so I had an option. Sometimes it was, I don't know, it never happened, but I think it could happen this, or I think I connected with this. And so it was like working a little bit with them, with their experience also. I didn't do this all the time, but I did it in 2 or 3 moments with 2 or 3 ideas that I had that were a little more risky, perhaps. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, and Casey, you talked about this a little bit too, right?
Yeah, my book was more explicitly nonfiction, but that doesn't, because it was edited together in an oral history style where the questions are taken out of the interviews, there was still a lot of decisions around what to leave in, what to leave out. And I had felt overwhelmed by like TED Talk culture, of like, or like the internet videos that say, I'm going to tell you 5 important things you need to know right now. And my big goal was to be the antithesis of that and to like let people ramble. And although it's a book about death, there's a lot in the book about everything and anything else. I think for me, for whatever, I don't really know why, but it was important for me to let people spin out a little bit and talk about other things. And so there were a lot of decisions around what's important, what to leave in, what to take out. And especially around death, when you're talking to somebody about something so important to them, you may elect to leave out a small detail that is not a small detail to them. So I thought about that a lot, and I, whenever possible, would talk to the people again about their pieces and what they thought was important and let them look at their pieces and revise things in some cases. So there was still a lot of questions around what to include.
Yeah, and this again is for both of you. In your interviews, did you ever feel like you were taking on the role of therapist or counselor, or did you find that people spoke to you differently because they knew you were a writer?
Well, I had especially one situation with a lady that told me a story, and after telling me this story, she told me that she had never told this to anybody, and this was incredible, and I felt that a big relief in her, And next day she came back with a kind of present for me, and she wanted to thank me because she had been able to tell this story. I think I was like a happy accident there for her. I catalyzed something, but I'm glad that I helped her. And this was very this was very awkward. Yeah. And yeah, if besides that, I just wanted to add one thing concerning what I told just a moment. Just I invented things and I explored fiction, but everything that is connected with the medical profession, in that level, I didn't invent anything. And not only that, but when the book was finished, I gave the manuscript to 3 people in this unit and to a friend of mine that is a doctor. And I really asked them to correct anything that was not accurate. I knew I had a margin to invent in some level, but I didn't want to invent in this professional level. And they were very sincere, and we changed 2, 3 little details that were small details, but that's finally very important. Yeah.
And yeah, I found myself taking on that role a lot, maybe not therapist, but trustee of information. And I think because for me, it was some of the interviews were with people that I idolized, like Art Spiegelman, the cartoonist that did Mouse is in there, and some of my favorite musicians and philosophers and people, but there are also just people I know in my life who I sort of knew in a low level way had traumatic experiences or interesting experiences. And one of which was an old schoolmate whose twin brother had shot himself by accident when they were kids, his twin brother. And so he talked a lot about how, nobody wants to hear the story, like, I mean, everybody wants to hear the story because it's fascinating, and nobody wants to bring it up because it's like, you wouldn't know where to stop. You wouldn't know how to be there for somebody who's gone through something that you yourself had never gone through. So sitting with him, I mean, we both just cried at different points in the conversation. And I think I thought about that a lot in reading Eduardo's book, where these medical professionals are talking about trying to not cry. And there's a woman in the book who is sort of proud of the fact that, yeah, she cries. It's okay. Like it's good to be there for these people, for these families. And I related to that so much from having all these interviews with folks of trying to figure out where that line is. And at what point is it about you and your pain, which Eduardo also talks about in the book. And at what point when are you helping and when are you piling on to commiserate with someone?
No, that's wonderful. Thank you, Casey. Before we wrap up, we have one question from Michelle and Albert. They ask, so this is a follow-up on Casey's question about distance. Was it ever too much to take on and feel the grief of your subjects, or did you find that essential to the project? And this question is for both of you, of course.
Well,
Eduardo, let me go first. Let me go first because I want you to have the last word because this is your book reviews. So I'll very quickly, I mean, I think I sort of just said that it had been too much at different points, but that was also the great value of doing it. And mostly because outside of the book now, I feel like I have a little more, even though they're not my personal experiences around grief and death, I feel like I have ways to reflect on those huge questions that I didn't have before, and that I feel more comfortable sitting with dark or uncomfortable things with people. And that, so in retrospect, I'm really glad that I went through that. But I want to hear Eduardo. So.
No, in my case, one thing I did was that I didn't spend all the time there in Rouen, and I also went back to my home in Bordeaux, the south of France. And this was also like a method I found finally to leave, to bring back some distance, and to go back, to return to Rouen. And this this method I found, it revealed good, because not only I needed this distance because it was very intense, but also because the simple fact of returning home and telling things to my wife, to my friends, it was revealing. When I was telling things, it was revealing for me the things I could easily tell, the things where I still had doubts, the things that were still difficult to tell, emotionally difficult. And finally, I was like a painter, no, that draws back, takes another look to the tableau, yeah, and comes back. And when I went back to Rouen, I went back with new questions, perhaps even questions that friends of mine asked me, but you didn't ask them about, I don't know, about vacations, or you didn't ask them about, etc. And so this helped me emotionally, but also to find like new perspectives each time I went back to Rouen. Yeah.
Thank you, Eduardo. And I believe that brings us to the end of our afternoon/evening. My enormous gratitude once again to Eduardo, Casey, Daniel, Kristina, and everyone at Seminary Co-op for this brilliant conversation and for trusting with the launch of this brilliant book. Both Third Place Books and Seminary Co-op have tons of copies of An Ideal Presence in stock. They're beautiful and out on display. Really, this book is an instant favorite of mine. It is as humbling and reverent as it is powerful, and I know so many of you are going to love it. So on behalf of the bookstore, please have a wonderful week and please be well.